Scott, to lead off, just briefly give us a definition of what BT corn is.
Yeah, this is going to be a pretty basic presentation, but I think a lot of people really still don't understand the basics of BT or GMO technologies. And BT corn is a GMO technology. You'll hear people call it transgenic as well. It gets its name from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis. And what they've done is they've taken genes from that bacteria that produce insecticidal toxins, and they've inserted it into the genes of the corn plant. And so what that means is, depending on where it's inserted into the plant, that as that plant grows, the tissues, maybe not all the tissues, are going to express these BT toxins, which are proteins, and presumably kill the insects that feed on the plant.
Okay. So which pests specifically are affected by the BT technology?
Well, it's a gamut, but most of the BT technologies for use in corn affect two groups of insects. The ones that we're most interested in Tennessee control some of the caterpillar pests. In the Midwest, where they have some significant beetle pests that I'll talk about in a minute, they use different BT traits that control that beetle pest. So we're talking about different groups of toxins. So if you look at the BT corns that we typically grow in Tennessee, they contain these toxins that are called cry proteins. They may also produce a toxin called a VIP protein. And there's different kinds of cry proteins. There's cry1, there's cry2, there's cry2AB, cry2AE, and that's kind of like a class of BT toxins, and they have different spectrums of activity. So some are better at controlling, say, corn earworms than the others. And so right now, because we're kind of further along into the BT corn technologies, we have BT corns that express 2 or 3 different BT traits, and that expands the control that they provide over a wider group of insects. The insect we're probably most concerned about in West Tennessee is the southwestern corn borer, and there's another one called the European corn borer that are significant pests of corn and traditionally have been, and the European corn borer is a big pest in the Midwest.
What other pests are controlled by BT technology, and how well are they controlled?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll stick right now with the caterpillar theme. So the newer BT technologies, depending on which group of toxins are in those plants, some of them control corn earworm very well, some control it very poorly. Fall armyworm is another one we occasionally see in West Tennessee, and some of them are a little better or worse against fall armyworm. Now, the reality is when BT corn was first introduced, the primary target pest was those corn borer species, either southwestern and European. In my opinion, they still are. That's the one we need to be most worried about. The good news is really all the BT corn technologies we're growing provide excellent control of southwestern and European corn borer. When we talk about things like corn earworm, I have a hard time proving to anybody, let alone myself, that it's actually causing us much economic damage at all in corn. So having activity on corn earworm doesn't excite me really a whole lot.
You bring up economics. You've done some research on the economics of BT technology. What did you find?
Well, just in my test plots over the last several years in Milan, we've seen anywhere from 20 to 40, 50 bushel yield responses from growing a BT corn compared to the same variety that doesn't have BT corn. And it's pretty consistent. It gets more consistent in your later plantings, which makes sense because your later plantings not only tend to face higher populations, but they tend to be more susceptible when they get infested. The reality of the situation is it's really kind of hard in today's environment to know what value they may or may not have because so many people are growing it. If we weren't growing so much of it, we'd have much worse corn borer problems than we currently have right now.
There's many different BT traits. Can you talk about some examples of those?
Yeah, and I will. And that'll back me up to talking about some of these traits that have beetle activities. I mentioned the cry proteins. Well, there are cry proteins that have activity on certain beetle larvae. And instead of being cry1 or cry2, they're like cry30 and cry3 something. They have different nomenclatures for them, and they have activity specifically on some of the corn rootworm species. In the Midwest, the western corn rootworm, and to a lesser extent, the northern corn rootworm are major pest of the corn. In fact, that's their major pest of corn up there. And the adults are called western corn rootworm, beetles. We have a similar species in the south called the spotted cucumber beetle. The larvae is called the southern corn rootworm. These technologies don't work well on that, but they work very well on the western corn rootworm. They grow a lot of it. That's their primary target in the Midwest. We very rarely see problems with that pest in the South anywhere, and because of that, we don't traditionally grow the technologies that have that rootworm activity. You have to really study corn, really all these varieties, because the variety name doesn't necessarily give away what the BT technologies are in there. So if you look, we have a publication, it's our insect control guide. It lists all the different traits out there. It lists how good they are at controlling certain different pest caterpillars, or whether or not they control the rootworm species, but it may not be that obvious when you look on the bag tag. So the original BT corn that came out was called Yield Guard. A lot of people remember that, just like the original BT cotton was called Bow Guard. Those had a single gene in there. They worked very well on corn borer and of course corn. Now we have things like Smart Stacks, which has multiple proteins in there, including proteins to control those rootworm beetles. We have corn called Viptra, which has this VIP trait. That VIP trait improves your control of corn earworm feeding in the ear. Again, you go to our publication, there's a whole bunch of list of different trade names, depending on the company and how they're marketing them, and you really have to study to kind of understand which BT traits are being offered, which caterpillars they're going to control. But again, the good news is everything I list in that publication, our Insect Control Guide publication, and almost everything for sale in Tennessee, if it's a BT corn, would control those corn borers, and again, that's the primary target.
You mentioned that BT corn is very widely used in our area. How do farmers manage for resistance?
Great question, because it is so widely used and because it is very effective on some of the primary target pests. You worry about resistance. Something that puts a lot of selection pressure on a population that works very well on them. There's obviously some selection for that insect to develop resistance to the BT technologies. The primary method to moderate or mitigate resistance is actually by making sure we grow some non-BT corn or cotton, depending on which crop you're talking about. So in corn, there's actually mandatory refuge requirement, and I take for granted that people know what these things are, but when I talk to people, I find out they don't necessarily know at all what the refuge is for. So if you're in a cotton growing area of Tennessee, and that's defined, there's certain counties that are labeled as cotton growing areas, you're supposed to have at least, depending on the technology, 20% non-BT corn planted. The purpose of that non-BT corn is to produce insects that haven't been selected for resistance to the BT technologies. The idea being is that in the rest of your BT crop, if you select for resistance and there's a few rare individuals that survive and are resistant to that technology, they're very likely going to end up mating with the insects coming out of the refuge. And what happens is when they blend those genes, they're not as resistant anymore, and it's very likely that should they go feed on BT corn again, they'll actually die. So that's the whole refuge concept. In corn, it's a structured, mandated refuge. That means they have to plant non-BT corn. In cotton, we don't have a mandated refuge where we have to plant non-BT cotton, but instead we rely on natural host and other crops to produce the refuge. So the concept, and I think you'll see a graphic of it's really pretty simple. You got susceptible insects coming out of the refuge. They're going to mate with any resistant ones coming out of the BT corn, and that dilutes the genes and presumably, if not eliminates the risk of resistance, at least delays it.
Are there guidelines on how you structure your refuge?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated in Tennessee. Again, in the cotton growing counties, it's very different than in the non-cotton growing counties. And it also somewhat depends on the trait. for example, the rootworm traits, which we're not growing a lot of, requires that refuge actually has to be in the same field or immediately adjacent to the field. And that's related to the biology of those rootworm species, because the beetles don't move very far. And so you want to make sure your refuge is in close proximity to the BT corn. With the corn borers and the Lepidoptera, they're a little bit more mobile, and that refuge can be in the field or up to a half-mile away. And again, it has to be at least 20% of the BT corn acreage that is planted, and more for some of the older technologies. A lot of people will maybe strip it in the field, or they'll just plant 25% of the field and then switch over to a BT variety and finish out. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and a lot of this information will actually be on the seed tag. They'll put it on there when they deliver the seed and tell you what the refuge requirements are for the technology you just bought. So making it complicated. Tennessee's one of the worst states. And the reason is because we have areas designated as corn growing areas, areas designated as cotton growing areas. It's a little simpler to comply to the refuge requirements in the corn growing areas, because with some of these new technologies, the refuge can be as little as 5%. And in fact, what they do is they'll mix the non-BT corn seed in the bag of the BT corn seed. They call that refuge in a bag. So when you plant, you're automatically planting 5% of the crop to the refuge. Makes it very easy for the grower to comply. But again, you can't do that in cotton growing areas. That doesn't count.
All right, so as you wrap up, final take-home message on BT corn.
Well, I'm a big fan of it, and I think people underappreciate it because they kind of forget the old days when we had corn borers flying around everywhere and there was just constant yield losses. People didn't manage for them very well. You can manage for corn borers with insecticides, but it's tricky. So I think we need to use BT corn almost to its fullest capacity. Try to get that 80% allowed acres in a lot of our areas. What we see is if we start growing a lot of non-BT corn, those corn borers sneak back in and they start causing us yield loss. So besides using it, we need to manage it appropriately, and that means following the refuge guidelines to make sure the technology is durable and stays durable for the long time. And it is a requirement. It's checked occasionally by the company, so you can get in a little bit of trouble if you don't do it. You don't always get checked, but I think it's also just the right thing to do.
Where can we go for more resources on this?
Oh yeah, that's great. We have a lot of online resources, and I think a lot of people are aware of them. You know, kind of our base home is the UT Crops platform. There's a utcrops.com, there's our UT Crops news blog, there's a pest guide information, and honestly, if you go to any one of those things and you can just Google that, it'll all interconnect and interlink, and there's a lot of good resources about the kinds of technologies that are out there, how you should manage certain pests, what the refuge requirements are. And again, I said it's complicated. You can also reach out, send me an email or call me, and I'll answer questions. You've got a lot of good stories where people have made the wrong decision by buying the wrong BT corn technology or not understanding what the limitations are. I appreciate everybody's attention, and again, reach out to UT in general. We have a lot of good resources and a lot of good specialists and tips about managing corn.